So I call this presentation Out of the Blue, 6 non-medication ways to relieve depression. And again, there are other ways to relieve depression. We're just going to focus on these particular 6. Most people know the typical ones. Again, either medications, psychotropic medications, mood-altering medications, neuropsychotropics, and most people know the typical cognitive ways that we treat depression. I'm going to give you 6 alternate ways because I come from a different background than either that pharmacological approach and that cognitive approach. This is the book that the presentation is based upon. I wrote this for Norton. It came out in 2014, mid-2014 if memory serves. And it's called Out of the Blue, same thing, 6 non-medication ways to relieve depression. So if you want to, go over this stuff, I will give you the Cliff Notes, the summary version of what's in this book. There's a little more in the book, obviously, and sometimes I do this as a whole day or 2-day presentation. So we're going to move through this stuff very, very quickly. But if you want to follow up, you can get the slides, as I said. You can look at the handouts that I've sent ahead, or you can check out the book. So here we go. So the first thing that I can tell you is that I'm going to be talking about some ways that may, surprise you in terms of treating depression. And I want you to know I take this seriously. And the reason I wrote this book and the reason I teach on this subject is that I was depressed when I was younger. I grew up in a big, close-knit family around Chicago area, big Irish Catholic family, 7 brothers and sisters. And I went away to college. I went 2,000 miles away. I went from Chicago to Arizona State, which is around the Phoenix area. And I was a very shy guy at the time. And first time away from home, kind of freedom. I didn't have much money. My parents weren't that wealthy. I'd saved up money and I doled it out to myself every week, or my parents helped me kind of set a budget because I wasn't very good at that. And I was pretty irresponsible with my money, so I wasn't eating well. I was buying books and records with my money rather than food, and those were priorities for me. And I had freedom, and I found it hard to make friends because I was so shy. And I made a couple of friends, but they were about as shy and introverted and also troubled as I was. So I started to be more and more troubled. And I found myself sleeping 20 hours a day. I just didn't go to class after a while. I didn't know what depression was. I'd never heard of depression, and there wasn't so much education or public awareness about it at the time. I couldn't get myself to a therapist. I didn't even know that's what I needed. But I basically became extremely depressed, and I became suicidal after a while. And so I will tell you a bit more of that story as we go along, but I want you to know that when I treat people and when I talk to people about depression, I take this seriously because it was almost a fatal problem for me. That is, I almost killed myself and I didn't. And the fact that I didn't and the fact that I came out of my depression is part of what this whole presentation will be based upon. So I will just skip the details for now because I want to save them for another section. I think it will have more impact. And so you're going to see us, there you're going to see me there in my hippie days back in the 70s. And when I was sitting playing guitar mostly, that was what I did, or read or slept. And I spent most of my time alone. I had a couple of friends, as I said, but we didn't see each other that much. And I became more and more depressed. And this picture is going to mean something a little later. So the first thing I want to talk about, just so we're on the same page, is challenge some myths about depression that are pretty widespread and believed about it. First, because there's a lot of advertising now, and drug companies have they have a financial incentive to get us to believe certain things. They will show you a commercial, at least in the US, some of you are watching this outside the US, but I think this has been spread all around the world, that we know the cause of depression, that it's biochemical and genetic. And to tell you the truth, if you go deeply into research about depression, no one knows the cause of depression. Or maybe a better way to say it is that it's, you know, genetic components obviously have an influence on everything that we think or do or feel or experience. Things that happen in our bodies, things that happen in our neurology. But most people who know genetic research really well say, here's a quotation from a CEO of a gene discovery company. For most common diseases, specific genes are almost never associated with more than a 20 to 30% chance of getting sick. So genes don't explain everything. The strongest predictor of major depression, says another psychiatrist, is still your life experience. There aren't genes that make you depressed. There are genes that make you vulnerable to depression. Just like there are genes that make you vulnerable to obesity or anxiety or getting cancer or whatever it may be. Genes do influence this. So the second myth that I want to talk about is that if we knew the cause and we determined totally the cause, which we haven't, it's typically multifactored, I think, that would be related to how we intervene. So I think cancer is another good analogy for this, because sometimes the researchers in cancer research are saying, forget what causes it. Let's see if we can intervene in the process of it. And so some people are working on angiogenesis, starving the cancer cells from blood. And so they will give people drugs that will withdraw the blood, make sure that the blood vessels can't grow very well. And then the cancer cells, which are a little more vulnerable than the healthy cells, die off a little more quickly than the other cells. So that's an approach that has nothing to do with the cause of cancer, but it's the process of cancer. And that's what we're going to be talking about in this presentation, is intervening in the process and creating solutions. So another of the myth is that antidepressants are the only effective treatment and they're all that's needed. And I think we've talked about that a bit. So we're going to be talking about 6 strategies, new possibilities, probably that you either have somewhat considered or never considered for effective intervention. And these are alternate approaches to use with your clients or patients for those people that aren't responding to your usual interventions or aren't responding to medications if they're on medications, all right? So that's the book, Out of the Blue. It's published by Norton. And here's an interesting set of statistics. We're not going to get into too much in the way of diagnosis or statistics, but I think this one is illuminating. The first is that rates of depression have radically increased in recent years. Now, that could be because of better diagnosis, but there was pretty good diagnosis back in the 70s. And between treatment for depression has increased between 300% by 300% between 1987 and 1997. It's gone up a little more since then. By 1997, 40% of psychotherapy patients, double the percentage of the decade before, had a diagnosis of mood disorder. So either we're changing our diagnostic procedures or depression is growing. The percentage of population for depression grew from 2.1% in the early 80s to 3.7% in the early 2000s, an increase of 76%. So are people's biochemistries changing? Perhaps. Are their genetics changing? Probably not. Use of antidepressants has nearly tripled from 1988 to 2000. And here's a really interesting, to me, statistic. Immigrants tend to have the same rates of depression as their adopted culture or country rather than rates from the places from which they came. So if they came from Thailand, and Thailand had let's say a 4% depression rate in the culture, and then they came to the United States, which has about a 9% depression rate in the general population, they tend to have depression at 9% rates if you took a bunch of people who came from Thailand to America. So that's curious. It's maybe that they're eating different foods, and maybe that there's more stress in this country than there was in Thailand. But that does tell you something, that it's not all genetics and biochemistry, right? So,
I had my first...
Sorry, I'm going to go back for this one. There's a great interview that I heard by Andrew Solomon, who's the author of this book, The Noonday Demon, An Anatomy of Depression. Terry Gross, who's an interviewer in the US on a radio show called Fresh Air, great interviewer. She has him on, and he's talking about the experience of depression. When I heard this, I was struck by this because it was the most clear and poignant description of the depression that I've experienced and that a lot of people that I work with in psychotherapy have told me has been their experience. Now, everybody's experience is a little different, but if you haven't experienced depression or you don't know it from the inside out very well, as I do and other people who've experienced do, I think this description is a really good one. So let's just take a moment and listen to it.
I had my first really severe breakdown in about 1994. I had been going along about my life and I'd been through some things that were quite traumatic and quite difficult, the most striking one being the death of my mother at the end of a long battle with cancer. And I was feeling very down and very blue and rather grief-stricken. I had some additional personal traumas. And then I began to feel really increasingly sad. And then I began to feel sort of numb. And then I began to find that things were just a little bit effortful and that I didn't seem to be able to muster very much emotion about anything. And then things began to become more effortful, and I would get home and have messages on my answering machine, and I would think, all those people, I need to call back all of those people. And I would think, I have to go out and I have to get things to eat, and I have to get through the day, and it all seemed like somehow more than I could manage to do. And I thought that was very strange, but I was still able to keep up a facade of functioning reasonably well, and I assumed that it was just a temporary thing, and I didn't really pay very much attention to it. And then it began to get more severe, and I began to have this feeling of dread and anxiety, which was sort of like the feeling you might have if you had tripped and you were about to fall, that sort of middle of the air feeling before you quite hit the ground, but it was extended, and this feeling of dread got worse and worse, and I began coming home and hearing messages on my answering machine and thinking not simply that I didn't want to call people back, but that I didn't know how I ever could. I would think, who are those people? How am I ever going to catch up with them? What am I ever going to do? How am I going to... And they were just messages from friends and people who wanted to be in touch. And I would think, I have to get dressed. I have to put on my clothes. I have to put on both socks. I have to put on both shoes, and the whole business of ordinary daily life began to seem so effortful and so overwhelming, and I really didn't understand what was happening to me, but I kept trying to battle through it, still thinking, this doesn't make any sense, this is so weird. And then I became more and more anxious and more null, and I had more and more this feeling that was a mix of sadness and fear, until finally I felt I simply couldn't do anything. And I found myself at last lying in bed one day thinking, I can't get up. And I lay there thinking, I can't put the toothpaste on my toothbrush. I can't brush all of my teeth. It just seemed like such an overwhelming task. It seemed much more frightening and much more overwhelming than at this point it seems to me, for example, to come and do an interview on National Public Radio. And I thought, how am I going to get out of bed? And I lay there in bed just shaking with fear and feeling completely unable to do anything and feeling no emotion of any kind except that fear and anxiety. And I thought, I have to call someone. I have to get out of my apartment. And I couldn't reach for the telephone. I lay there staring at the telephone thinking, you just pick it up and you dial. But I simply couldn't do it. And fortunately someone called me and I said, something has gone terribly, terribly wrong with me.
So again, I think that's a very poignant description, very close to my description or my experience of being depressed. And again, many people with whom I've talked about that. I don't know if you know that Lincoln, our American president, suffered what was called at the time melancholy, suffered from melancholy, basically depression, and that he had two really severe depressions in which he was suicidal, and friends had to keep suicide watch on him 24 hours a day. In the first one, they had to hide all the sharp objects in his house, and they had to sit with him for 24/7. And he had very good friends. He was a very good friend maker, Lincoln. And I found this in one of the letters he wrote to his best friend, and he said, on his second depression, his friend had moved to a different part of the country. I am now the most miserable man living. If what I feel were equally distributed to the whole human family, there would not be one cheerful face on the earth. Whether I shall ever be better, I cannot tell. I awfully forebode I shall not. To remain as I am is impossible. I must die or be better, it appears to me. Now, We'll get back to something that moved Lincoln in a little while when we go through one of these strategies. But Lincoln did not kill himself, in part because he thought he had something to do on this planet, and he couldn't die before he left a legacy and had contributed to his fellow human beings. So we're going to get back to that as one of the parts of one of the pathways out of depression. So here are the 6 strategies. I'm just going to give you an overview of them, and then we'll get into the details of each of them. One I call marbling, and I'll explain what that means in a moment. It's probably a little confusing to you or unknown to you at this point. Second one is I call undoing depression. The third one is shifting the relationship with depression. The fourth one is challenging isolation and restoring and strengthening connections as a pathway out of depression. The fifth one is a future with possibilities, and this one really worked for me, sort of worked for Lincoln as well. And the sixth one is called restarting a brain growth. So let's just get into them one at a time. The first one is marbling, and what I mean by marbling is my father was in the meat business when I was growing up. He had studied to be a lawyer, rebelled against his father, gone into the meat business because he started sweeping the docks at a meat company, and then he worked his way up and he owned his own company. And he taught me about meat because he said this little white part in the meat is called marbling, and it's the fat part, and it's what gives the meat some different flavor. And I really like that. Most of it's meat and there's a little fat, and that's called the marbling. I started using this technique when I was working with people with depression because one of the things that characterizes depression is sort of all or nothing thinking. It's like, oh, everything's terrible. And when I was depressed, I would look back on the past and I couldn't remember a good memory. I would only remember the bad things or even good things. I would have a sort of a opposite of rose-colored glasses view of them. I would have a negative view of even good things that had happened. I would dismiss them or I wouldn't remember them. And so marbling is this sense of helping people have a more complete view of their experience rather than this one-sided view that their current experience of depression leans them towards, that they're remembering and they're perceiving things in a very negative or dreary light or horrifying light or flat light, one of those things, and those are typical in the depression experience. So what I'll do is I'll go back and forth between tell me about depression, tell me about times when you aren't depressed, tell me about your experience of when you can't get out of bed, tell me experience when you can get out of bed. So instead of being positive and just saying cheer up or it's not so bad, I'll sort of smuggle in a more nuanced view of their experience. And what I find is even during the session when I'm doing that, people get a little less depressed because, and again, this sort of goes back to brain science, this new stuff we're learning, the brain tends to get grooved, and the more you think of depression and the more you talk about depression, typically the more depressed you get. But what are we doing as therapists? We're talking to people about their depression, which of course we have to do to find out about it and to help them about it. But if we do it too much, we're part and parcel of the problem sometimes, and we're helping them groove in those depression kind of grooves. So I want to investigate times and aspects of non-depression while finding out about the depressive experience. So I go back and forth, and I want to get a map of tell me about what depression looks like, tell me about what non-depression times. And as I do that, they tend to get a little less depressed. And also I find some resources which we'll use in a little while. So there's been some research on this. Focusing mainly on depression could actually add to the problem. A recent study had people talk to each other about problems, and they found that their stress hormones increased, which predicts, cortisol. They had more cortisol in their system, which predicts increased anxiety and depression over time. So people are sometimes kind of talking themselves into, and we as counselors or therapists are talking them into more depression, not realizing it, when we focus only on the depression. Now, you can't not talk about the depression because you don't want to deny it or minimize it, but if you exclusively talk about the depression, it could be a problem. So there are some research studies that have come out of the positive psychology field. This study of what helps people feel better and feel happier and feel life is more meaningful and all that stuff. And one study found that when people who are naturally pessimistic, which is correlated with depression, who spent 1 week doing exercises in which they identified, they had them do 3 or 4 different exercises, so they had 3 or 4 different phases of this or sections of this study. This was done by Martin Seligman and his colleagues. Some of you know his work. One is they had a bunch of people who rated themselves severely to moderately depressed, and they identified and wrote down 3 times in the past when they were at their best. They had another group write down their personal strengths. They had another group express gratitude to people they'd never properly thanked. And they had another group write down 3 good things that happened when they measured their depression levels 6 months later and their happiness levels. They were all less depressed and happier. They did another one. They had people fill out a survey on their website, and they found people who were severely depressed, and they asked them for 15 days to just recall and write down 3 good things that happened each day for 15 days. And 94% of them took that, it was a HAM-D scale for depression, Hamilton D. And 94 of them went from severely depressed to mildly or moderately depressed during that time. Now, if I could get my clients from severely depressed to mildly or moderately depressed, I could get them to do a lot of other things that would help them get out of depression. So I thought that was quite shocking to get these very simple interventions that help people kind of bring in some positive things in the midst of their depression. And that's the case that I'm making in this particular thing. There's been an overview, a meta-analysis done by Sonia Liebermersky, and a colleague, and they found that 51 positive psychology interventions over 4,000 individuals, when they threw all these studies together, they found that positive psychology interventions do significantly enhance well-being and decrease depressive symptoms. So this idea that you only have to talk about or deal with the depression, you can't bring in anything else into the sessions, I think is wrong-headed, and these studies point us in that direction. So be careful, of course, of just minimizing or being positive. And the way I do this is what I call acknowledgement and possibility. I move back and forth between depression and non-depressive moments and experience. This just, validates people in their depressive experience, and it gives them the other message that it's not always going to be that way, and it's not all that way at this moment. It hasn't been all that way in the past. So it gives them a reminder that they aren't always and haven't always been depressed. It can also illuminate and give hints to skills, abilities, and connections that could potentially lead out of depression or at least reduce depression level. So sometimes I'll say, it's really hard for you to get out of bed to come to the session today. How did you get out of bed? I'm really curious about that. And so we'll go back and forth between acknowledging how hard it was to get out of bed because they had very little energy, very little motivation, they could barely move, but somehow they did get dressed and come into the office. So I want to find out about both sides of those. And this is a letter from Abraham Lincoln, who he sent it to a young woman who was suffering from depression, and this young woman was the daughter of one of his generals, and he had known this young woman since she was a child, and she was in her 20s, and she was so devastated by her father's death that she got depressed, and she hadn't been out of bed in months, maybe close to a year, and he found out about it, and he wrote her this wonderful letter, which for me illustrates this whole acknowledgement and possibility, acknowledging the pain and inviting the person out of the pain, acknowledging the depression and the hopelessness, and inviting people out. So I'll just read it to you. Dear Fanny, this is Abraham Lincoln writing to this young woman. It's with deep grief that I learn of the death of your kind and brave father, and especially that it is affecting your young heart beyond what is common in such cases. In this sad world of ours, sorrow comes to all, and to the young it comes with bitterest agony because it takes them unawares. The older have learned to ever expect it. So he's normalizing grief is a part of life, and this terrible experience is part of life. Here's the next part of the letter. I'm anxious to afford some alleviation of your present distress. Not all alleviation, he's saying, some alleviation. Perfect relief is not possible except with time. I loved how he slipped that in. Like, you won't get better except over time. You cannot now realize that you will ever feel better. Is this not so? I really love these lines because I studied with Milton Erickson, who was an eccentric psychiatrist, and he used to do double negatives sometimes. You can't not change. Weird stuff like that. And Erickson once said to me, if you can't say the no, the patient will say the no. And there's a lot of no in here, but it's ultimately saying yes. You cannot now realize that you will ever feel better. Is this not so? And yet it is a mistake. You are sure to be happy again. To know this, which is certainly true, will make you some less miserable now. I have had experience enough to know what I say, and you need only believe it to feel better at once. I just thought this was such a great example of acknowledgement and possibility. So what I typically do is, like, I just ask people, teach me what depression looks like when you're living in depresso land. Tell me what that looks like. And when you're living in non-depresso land, or when you have lived in non-depresso land, or when you might in the future live in non-depresso land. So I just make a map of both things. And so I had a client who was having trouble getting out of bed. She wouldn't get out till noon. She'd stay in her pajamas all day. She'd take a shower at 7 o'clock at night. She wouldn't see her friends. She would quit her job or call in sick. And I said, well, so tell me about a day when you're not depressed. She said, well, I get out of bed, I get dressed right away, and I get out of the house. Now that's a big difference between those 2 days. So I'm just asking her about, tell me about a day like this, tell me about a day like this, tell me about your experience here, tell me about your actions here. And I'm just comparing and contrasting. And what she ultimately worked out is she had to make appointments with friends because she would feel too guilty canceling them, and get herself out of the house even on days when she was depressed. And she was able to move herself out of depression a lot quicker than she usually did. The medications weren't working and other things weren't working. And she was able to do that given this, that we'd found some of the patterns of non-depression and imported them into depresso land. All right? So I usually make sure that I'm including the negative and the positive, so I'm not just Pollyannish and positive about this, because when people are depressed, they sometimes can't take in the positive. So the first thing I do is give them permission to be depressed and not to be happy or cheerful. And so it's okay to feel depressed. You don't have to have hope right now. I also want to acknowledge that they sometimes have opposite experiences. You can be hopeless and have hope at the same time. And I talk about exceptions. You feel hopeless except when you don't. I mean, sometimes people who feel hopeless come to therapy. Now, why would they come to therapy if they didn't have some measure of hope? So I want to include, and there are 3 ways to include, as you see here on the slides: permission to and not to, inclusion of opposites, and exceptions to the usual rules. All right? So what I want to do, another thing I want to do as part of this marbling, is discover exceptions to the rule of depression or the patterns of depression, discover resources and solutions. So I find out about moments of non-depression. I find out what happens when the depression starts to lift differently from when they're in the middle of it. And I ask why they're not more depressed, or why they, and without being provocative, why they haven't, if they're feeling suicidal, why they haven't killed themselves. What stopped them? And they usually say, oh, I wouldn't do that to my kids, or, I couldn't do that to my family, or I feel that I'm on this planet for some reason, like Lincoln thought. So I sometimes will get the other side of things when I ask about resources and solutions and exceptions. And I sometimes find out about areas of competence where they can import some resources and solutions and some patterns and some ways of thinking and some ways of interacting that, again, bring in a little more nuanced difference from the depressed kind of all or nothing, it's all terrible kind of experience. All right, so moving on pretty quickly, because it took us a little while to do this introduction here, and we've got to get through 5 more here. Undoing depression is the second one, and it's related to the first one in some ways. What I mentioned that I studied with Milton Erickson, and Milton Erickson did this thing. He wasn't so interested in the diagnosis. He was interested in the pattern of things, like the pattern, and cognitive therapy does this too. what's the pattern of thinking, what's the pattern of behaving, what's the pattern of interaction, what's the pattern of perception, what's the pattern of memory. And so what I'm trying to do is figure out, if you were going to teach an actor to do depression, like a really good actor, a method actor who really knew how to get into a character, and you say, you know, I want you to be a depressed person in your next play or movie, they would, you know, they would wear certain clothes, they would act certain ways, they would talk in certain voice tones. There are patterns. And the way I think about this is, maybe there are parts of depression that you can't do much about, the genetic, biochemical parts, but there are parts that you have some influence about. How you speak, how you act, where you are, what you wear, all that stuff. And I want to find the patterns of how the person does depression. I don't mean this in a blaming way. It's like you create your own depression and you're responsible for it. I'm trying to find out the leverage points, the places where they could have a moment of choice and dress a certain way, or look up instead of looking down at the floor. Whatever the patterns that repeat when they're depressed, I want to find out what are the opposite of those patterns. How could they undo depression rather than do depression? So I want to discover repeating patterns involved with and associated with, oh sorry, there's a typo there, depressive experience, and help the person change those patterns in small or big ways. And the three places I typically look are patterns of doing, that is what they do, and that includes what they say, how they act, and how they interact. Patterns of viewing, and that includes what they're paying attention to and how they're making meaning of things. And patterns of context, that is where they are, around whom, you know, they spend time, or do they spend time alone? Are they in nature? Are they in their bedroom? Are they in their living room? Where are they? And around, what's surrounding them? There's some evidence of being out in nature is healing. But most people, of course, when they're depressed, spend a lot of time inside, pull the shades, they're not even seeing nature. So I'm trying to find what repeats again and again in the doing, the viewing, and the context, and then I'm trying to find anything to move them out of that, any other patterns. So any place that they have a moment of choice. And again, you don't want to do this in a blaming way, or, you know, a way that maybe if they don't have a choice in that area, you're not going to focus on that. But I want to find any patterns. And so, you know, I study with Milton Erickson, as I said, and he was a hypnotherapist. And after I studied with him, I started to look and think and hear my clients who were depressed as like being in a bad trance. And what I mean by that is they repeated the same thoughts, the same feelings, the same actions, the same patterns over and over again. And it was almost like a bad trance induction. It was like, you know, when the hypnotist goes, you're feeling sleepy, you're feeling very tired, you're going deeply into, they repeat things in this rhythmic way. Well, I started to think of symptom trance, depression trance, as the repetition of things. And if I could help people change those patterns or break those patterns, they would come out of that bad trance. So that repetition, I'm not going to tell you this story, it's going to take a long time. But one of the first places I realized this is I was studying with Milton Erickson, as I mentioned, the psychiatrist with whom I studied, an amazingly creative hypnotherapist and therapist. And one time he told me he was working with this guy was depressed, and he just couldn't get anything going with this guy. And he said to the guy, okay, I want you to go to be depressed in a library. And I'm thinking, as he's telling me this story, I'm like, what difference will that make? And this guy goes to the library, and every day he's sitting there depressed. But because he's at the library, you know, he gets a little bored, and he goes to the, you know, the stacks of books and magazines, and he's kind of curious about exploring caves, spelunking they call it. And he's never done this, but he's at the library, so he gets out a few books and a few magazines. He asks the librarian, and the librarian shows him where the section is, and he's there, and he's taking down books, and he's looking at it, and he's not really going to do anything, but he's just learning about this stuff because he's bored and he's depressed at the library all day. This is the heydays of public libraries. And so one day when he's going to the stacks and he's picking up some magazine or book, a guy is there looking at the same kind of material. And the guy turns to him and says, hey, I've just read about this. I've never actually done it. Have you ever explored a cave? And the depressed guy, that's Erickson's patient, says, no, I haven't. He said, well, how about this weekend we try it together, because neither of us know what we're doing, but if we read some of this stuff, we'll know how to do it a little better. And so they make a date, they go out there, and they explore some caves, and this guy makes a friend, and they start exploring caves, and the guy gets kind of excited. The depressed person gets kind of excited, and he's made a new friend, he's less isolated. And Erickson's telling me his case, the guy ultimately comes out of depression. And I'm thinking, how did Erickson know that sending him to the library would do that? And later, as I learned more about Dr. Erickson's work, I realized he didn't know. And he didn't tell me about the 100 cases where he sent someone to the library and it didn't work. But he just knew that if the guy was staying home, he was probably repeating the same patterns. If he could get him in a new environment, something new might happen. And it did in this particular case, all right? So sometimes I joke with my clients when they come in depressed, you know, and I use humor in even with depressed people. I don't do it if it's inappropriate or if they're not going along with it. But what I find is often they do get with it and they start to laugh even in the midst of a deep depression. So I'll say, look, teach me how to do a good depression your style, because I majored in depression in college. You know, I told you that story. And I tell them a little, you know, I was really depressed when I was younger. And plus, I've treated all these people who are depressed, so I know how to do a good depression. So I'll just list all these things and say, which one of these do you typically do? And so first thing, if I were going to create a good depression, I would stand still, stay still. Don't do anything like exercise that makes you breathe fast or hard, because that will put your depression at risk. And all of a sudden, people are smiling a little, even when they're depressed, when I'm using this kind of language. And I say, you know, so if you can, stay in bed. If not, sit in the same chair or lay on the couch. Make sure you don't move a lot. Secondly, isolate and avoid other people, right? Make sure you're not around other people. And if you can't avoid other people, try to talk to the same person or few people and talk to them about the same subject, usually how depressed or unhappy you or they are. You know, pick somebody who's depressed as well or who's very unhappy, and you can commiserate with one another. Sleep during the day and have insomnia at night, which is part of the isolation. You're sort of out of rhythm with other people. Brood on the past, your fears, your faults and resentments. Imagine that the future will be the same or worse than the past or the present. Eat terribly, overeat or undereat, whichever one you specialize in. Eat junk food, sugar, fat, you know, eat terribly basically. Don't pursue your hobbies or passions or spiritual interests. Drink alcohol, smoke cigarettes, or use other drugs. Again, whatever you might specialize in. Don't ask for help. And by the time I get to the end of this list and I say, now which one of these do you specialize in? People are chuckling, sometimes laughing as I'm reading the list. And they say, oh, I do that brood on the past, you know, or I do that sleep during the day and have insomnia at night. They'll tell me which one, or sometimes they'll say, I don't do any of that, I do this. But by then I've sort of prompted them to describe it in action terms rather than being terms. Like, I'm just depressed and there's nothing I can do about it. So this makes it so that it empowers them in some way, so they might be able to do something about it. So what I do is I try to identify patterns, locations and places, activities, timing and duration of something that they do or think, and then the sequences. What happens first, what happens next, what happens next. And then I try and help them mess around with those patterns and do anything that's not depression. So that's why I call this one Undoing Depression. Who are they around? That kind of stuff. All right. Third one, again, moving on fairly quickly here, and just for time purposes, shifting the relationship to depression. Now, this doesn't involve actually changing the depression, but changing how you experience it or view it or relate to it. So the first thing is mindfulness. There's a lot of research that's coming out that mindfulness can reduce suffering in the midst of suffering. So people who have chronic pain and people who are experiencing depression, they practice and learn a mindfulness technique. It doesn't have to be, you know, any religious or spiritual thing. It's just a technique of noticing without judging and noticing variations in your sensations, feelings, thoughts, and experiences around depression. So you can actually practice formal mindfulness meditation, or you can just become mindful and attend to your experience without judging. Like, this is terrible, I can't stand it. You notice that your mind is telling you this is terrible, I can't stand it. You don't have to change that or fix it. You just notice without judging. And then you notice when it goes up and down and changes a little, because most people, when they think about their depression experience, they think it's all the same. I'm always depressed. But if you actually pay close attention, which some people who've been trained in mindfulness do, like Buddhists who get depressed, they notice when they just stay with their experience that there are ups and downs. And sometimes they're actually out of depression during moments in the day. But most of us miss that because we go oblivious and we don't attend to our experience. Same thing with physical pain. So externalizing is the next one. This comes from a technique of psychotherapy called narrative therapy. And narrative therapy has this really interesting method of depersonalizing the problem. That is, most of us, they say, start to take it in. I'm not just depressed, I'm a depressive personality. Or I suffer from depression, or I have depression, or I am depressed. It's an internal experience, and narrative therapy has this way of kind of helping people move it out of themselves. They say, when depression comes to visit, how do you relate to it? Do you always believe everything the depression tells you, that you can't get out of bed, or that you're a terrible person, or that life is meaningless? And there's a set of procedures, and again, we won't have time to go into all these procedures here, just for time purposes, but it's a powerful technique with a set of questions that externalizes. It's like, you know, they talk about the depression in therapy as if it's an external, unwanted influence, and that it's a sort of a bullying and undermining influence. And again, we don't have time to go into all the details about this, but there's a rich literature in narrative therapy. So if you haven't found out about it, there's a book by friends of mine, Gene Combs and Jill Friedman, called Narrative Therapy, that I think is a good introduction to it, published by Norton. And so if you want to find out about it, it can be a really powerful, and I've seen some videos of people who do narrative therapy working with people who are depressed, and it's a pretty brief therapy and rapid approach when it's done with art and with respect. Next one is valuing depression. You know, I just went through a terrible loss. My adult son died last month. And I had therapist friends call me or write me and say, hey, I'll do therapy with you. And I thought, why would you do therapy? I mean, I'm just in grief. I'm just experiencing what you do when people die, when you're sad. Now, if you get stuck, I can understand going through therapy, but grief is just an experience. Same thing with depression. If you have a particular relationship to it, and you say, you know, there's a value to going through hard times in life. There's a value, and Milton Erickson, my teacher, said, in the Erickson family, we think of troubles in life as the roughage of life that helps life keep moving. And I think of the same thing. After being a therapist for 40-some years, I think, you know, emotions are just emotions. Trouble is just trouble. Depression, even as terrible as it is, if you stop resisting it, you can sometimes reduce the suffering. And again, that goes back to mindfulness. But even more, if you can mind the experience for something that transforms you or helps other people. You know, because I've been through tough stuff in my life, my own depression and other things, I can be more sensitive and empathic with other people. So can you mind the depression for value? The last one is follow your wound. I became a therapist in part because I'd been depressed when I was younger and I'd come out of it, and I wanted to help other people. So I made meaning out of my suffering, and I found a direction in life from the crisis and pain of depression. Now, I'm going to go through some fast stuff here. There's a bunch of research on mindfulness, partly because just, you know, time purposes. I'm a little behind where I wanted to be here. There's a whole bunch of research on what's called mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, where they teach people this approach to not judging your thoughts and just noticing your thoughts. And they have found that in these studies that mindfulness-based cognitive therapy is definitely as cost-effective as prescription drugs, and it also helps people stay better longer. That is, in comparison with people just being on medications, they get better and stay better longer when they use mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. So again, when you get these slides, you can get all the research here. I'll give you some of the references on the slides. So if this is something you're interested in, you can learn about it. You can find out about the research and also find out about the methods of how they do it. Externalizing, again, there are techniques for externalizing, and I'll just give you the quick overview on the slides. And then this valuing depression there's some evidence that depression can help focus attention and reduce distractibility, and help people think more deeply about their situations. So following your wound, that certainly was true for me, and it's certainly true for some other people that have experienced deep troubles in life, but depression being one of those troubles. And I say that there are two energies that are negative energies, that if you can transform them, become the things that tell you what you're supposed to do with your life. So I call these pissed and dissed. You're angry about how people responded to you or other people that had depression, or you're sensitized, that's the dissed energy, to this particular problem because you've been through this problem. All right? So again, we're going through this pretty quickly here, and the key is to transform these things rather than just use them as wounds. So the fourth method here, I'm just making sure I'm staying on time here, is challenging isolation. Most people who have emotional, psychological, behavioral problems, they suffer from this. That is, other people either push them away or withdraw from them, or they pull away from people or withdraw from other people. And what it turns out is that human beings generally do not do well in isolation. That is, we were evolved in groups and tribes, and it's partly how we succeeded on the planet. We were able to band together and help each other and raise the vulnerable infants, because other animals are born already able to be functioning on their own, but human beings aren't. So you need a tribe around you to protect the infants, to protect each other against predators that have sharper teeth and stronger muscles than we do and can run faster than we may. Isolation is not good for human beings. And depression invites people to isolation and disconnection. And it turns out there's a bunch of research that says the more you connect, the better you do. That is, the quicker you come out of depression. Again, I mentioned I've just been going through a grief experience, and I post every day on Facebook. I play music and I post a song a day. And when my son died or was dying, I said to my fiance, oh, I'm not going to post this song of the day. And she said, no, you have to. That's part of your daily thing. And I think it'd be really good to continue it. And I did, because I was a little messed up and she was clearer thinking than I was. And it's been an extraordinary experience to grieve with a community of support. And I realized how powerful that is. The grief was a lot, it was still difficult, but it was a lot easier to bear when I had so much love and support and kindness surrounding me. And I think that the problem is when people get depressed, they don't want to be around people because it's too painful or it's too embarrassing, or they feel like they're a burden on people. So they either pull away from people or they act kind of irritable. Sometimes when you're depressed, it's hard to be around people and you're not as patient and you're irritable, or you're just no fun to be around even if you're not irritable. You're kind of negative or depressed or flat, and other people naturally withdraw from you. So challenging that isolation is the fourth method. And I'm sorry, we're not going to have time to play that. It's an interesting example. So here's the problem. Why are we having more depression? One of the explanations is that social isolation is becoming much more common in modern societies. You get the family that goes on vacation and all four of them are looking at screens rather than being on vacation with one another. So shared family dinners and family vacations are down over a third in the last 25 years. Having friends to your house is down by 45% over the last 25 years. Participation in clubs and civic organizations is down by over 50% in the last 25 years. Church attendance is down by a third since the 60s. All these places where we naturally connected with people socially. The average number of people we consider close confidants dropped from nearly 1/3 from 2.94 in 1985 to 2.09 in 2004, and it may have gotten worse since then. The average American has only 2 close friends. 1 in 4 Americans, 25%, report they have no one to confide in. Average household size has decreased by about 10% during the past 20 years. We live in these big houses pretty much on our own. In 1990, more than 1 in 5 households were headed by a single parent. Currently, it's 1 in 3. 6.27 million people in the U.S. live alone. That's expected to increase, this was old statistics, to 29 million by 2010. People with 5 or more close friends, this is from the General Social Survey at the University of Chicago, excluding family members, are 50% more likely to describe themselves as very happy than respondents with fewer. So you're at risk if you're isolated. I heard Robert Putnam, who wrote the book Bowling Alone, say that it's more of a risk than smoking is for health conditions if you have few friends. That isolation is a worse stressor, risk factor, health-wise, and now we're talking about depression stuff, of course, than that. So I think there are 7 pathways to help people connect. The first 2 are within themselves. Help people connect to their inner selves, their deep self, their heart, their soul, their intuition. The second one is connect to their body, their physical self and sensations. And people who are depressed tend to dissociate a bit. They aren't so in touch with themselves because it's painful or difficult. But if we can help them make that connection back to their inner resources, then to their social resources, another being, and that may be an animal if they don't want to be around people, one close friend who understands and is accepting and doesn't pressure them or doesn't, shame them for being unhappy or flat or hopeless or whatever it may be, and maybe that we as the therapists are that connection. Others, to see if they can connect with a group or community. As I mentioned, going through grief in this community setting was quite a different experience than I think it would have been. Then the last 3 are connecting with something beyond yourself or beyond others, connecting through art. Some people transform their experience through art. Some people through being in nature. As I mentioned, there's some good good research that says being in nature is healing. You can be depressed inside or outside or with a view of the outside, and it seems to help to have connection to nature. The last one is to have a bigger meaning and purpose. That's what Abraham Lincoln did. When he was suicidal, depressed and suicidal, he couldn't kill himself because he thought he had a bigger purpose for being here. It turned out he was right, obviously. He made a big contribution in the world. He just wouldn't let himself kill himself before he'd fulfilled his life purpose. So that for some people, the bigger meaning is God or a higher power, but that connection, if it frays or they're lost, they sometimes lose their way. And so it can be any of these or any combination of these. And I investigate where people have lost their connection and help them restore their connection. All right, number 5, and we're moving on pretty quickly, as I said, because we just got a few more minutes and then I'll take some questions. Number 5 is a future with possibilities, and this is my story, actually. When I was suicidal, when I was depressed, I had 3 friends, and I thought, well, if I'm going to kill myself, it's kind of rude. My friends will be really shocked. I'm going to go say goodbye to them. And my first 2 friends were about as depressed and alienated as I was, and they understood. And they said, oh, yeah, I'm just too afraid to kill myself, so I admire your courage, was basically the gist. And they offered me, condolence and support. Sorry, you're going to have to die, but, we were hippies, and we had these woo-woo beliefs, and they said, I'll see you next life, basically. The third friend I went to was more normal, and she was like, what? Kill yourself? Why would you? No, you can't kill yourself. And I said, well, I just don't think I'm meant for this life. I'm just too sensitive. I can't be around people. I'm depressed. I didn't know the word depressed, but I'm unhappy. And I feel like I have no skin. And when I'm around people, everything hurts. I just feel all nerves. And I want to write my poetry. I don't want to be around people. I want to play music. I can't imagine making a living because I can barely get out of bed. And she said, look it. I have 3 aunts. They live in Nebraska. I'm their favorite niece. They don't have any children. They tell me when they die, I'll inherit everything they have. And one of the things that they've done is invested in farmland in Nebraska. When the food prices were down, the farmers would sometimes sell, or if they retired, they invested in these farmland. They would lease it out to the next door neighbor farmer. And she said, when I inherit one of these, there's always an empty farmhouse on one of these farms. And I promise you, if you'll promise me you won't kill yourself, you can go live in one of these farmhouses rent-free. You can write your poetry, play your music. You don't have to be around people. And you can grow your own food, which in my delusional state at 19, I actually thought I could do. I tried it years later. It was very difficult. And she said, you don't have to be around people. You don't have to make a living. You could sleep all day, if you need to. And I thought, well, that's a possibility. But I didn't bite too quickly. And I said, how old are your aunts? And she said, they're in their 60s. And, I was 19, and I thought, well, they're almost dead. They're like ancient, but it turned out they lived till their 90s. But I didn't know that at the time. And so I thought, well, the odds are in the next few years when I was in university in sort of this protected environment, one of them was going to kick off and I would be able to go live in that farmhouse. What happened for me immediately is I wasn't suicidal. I was still depressed, but a little less depressed because I connected to a future with hope where I'd have less pain and less suffering. And so for me, that was really, really powerful to connect to that future. And I think one of the things that happens for people that are depressed is there's a collapse of the future. That most people in life are a little future-minded, but people who are depressed are so stuck in the flat present or focused on the unhappy past. And when they look forward, all they can see is a repetition or an increase in that unhappiness or that flatness. So if we can restore their connection to a hopeful future, it can really make a difference. So that's this strategy, the fifth one we're talking about. And I call this future pull. That, you know, Viktor Frankl once told a story that I heard that was really moving to me. He almost died in the death camp, and he imagined himself after the death camp doing something meaningful, and it brought him out of that. So that farmhouse in my future was like what Viktor Frankl said. These difficult moments, we can be pulled through them. And that's why I call it future pull, by something that's worth living towards, even when you're suffering in the present. So I think that most of the time in psychotherapy, we're focused on the past, which is typical for psychotherapy, or the difficult present. And I sometimes turn that on its head. And when people are depressed, I don't talk too much about the past, or I don't ask them too much. I don't ask them too much about the present. I do a little as I'm doing that marbling. We talked about it first. I definitely want to know a little about that. But then I start to focus on where would you like to be? If life was how you wanted it to be, if you could come out of this depression. And then I start to say, and when you come out of this depression. So that's part of it. So that farmhouse in my future was my experience of being pulled through my depression. And so I sometimes do a technique that I call problems into preferences. So when people tell me about what they don't want or how depressed they are, I invite them to tell me what they would want by saying, okay, so you haven't been able to get out of bed very easily. When you're able to get out of bed, how will that be? So I focus on the future instead of the past. And I do this with positive expectancy language when you're able to get out of bed. First I say if you're able to get out of bed, and then after a while I start to seed in a little when you get out of bed, when you come out of this depression, when you're feeling more hopeful, when you have more energy. I sometimes have them write a letter from themselves in the future when they're through depression, they've come out the other side, to their present self who's suffering and discouraged. And then one of the first questions I ask when they come to therapy is, how will you know when we've done enough so that you can leave therapy? Now that's a different question than what brings you here or when did you start suffering from depression. I'm usually starting therapy in the future rather than the past. And so all these techniques are future-oriented techniques, which again is counterintuitive a lot because most psychotherapy is focused on the present or the past. I'm often doing psychotherapy focusing on the future. And so the sixth one, and this is the last one we'll cover, and this is one I saved the best for last because this is one of the most exciting to me. There's a whole bunch of research on the new brain science. And I think it's really relevant to how we can help clients who are depressed when we don't have access to medication or when the medication hasn't helped so much. And this will also give an alternate explanation for why some of these antidepressants might work different from the theories you see on television or you hear touted by a lot of neuropsychiatrists. And that is, this is called the neurogenic and neuroatrophy hypothesis of depression and how to use it in treatment. So let me give you a quick overview of the new brain science. There's been, in the last 30 years, 25 to 30 years, there's been a revolution in neurology and brain science understanding. When I was an undergraduate, I went to Arizona State, as I mentioned, out near Phoenix and Tempe, and I took neurological psych. And what they told us in neurological psych, and this wasn't that long ago, it was in the 70s, that's when I was a psychology student, they told us that the brain, once you went past childhood and early adolescence, it was pretty much fixed. You didn't grow any more brain cells, and you didn't make any new connections. The brain function was pretty static at that point. There was the occipital lobe that had to do with this, and there was the, the Broca's brain, that had to do with processing language, things like that. They were fixed areas of the brains. Well, that has all changed in the last 25 to 30 years. Revolution in brain science. So the old view said the brain had a fixed structure, set number of brain cells. One of my teachers told me, don't ride a motorcycle because you only got so many brain cells, and when you jiggle your brain, some of them die, so you're going to be killing off brain cells. It turns out there's billions of brain cells. So that's a crazy idea. The other crazy thing is, so basically the idea is those brain cells were fixed, the brain function and the number of brain cells was fixed. They decline over the aging process and with damage from trauma. So if you get traumatic brain injury, you lose a bunch and they never come back. Turns out that's not true. The new view is brain plasticity. Brain can grow new cells and make new connections throughout life. And this was radically, and not a radical view when it first came in the 70s, in the late 70s, early 80s, and really came to its to the fruition in the 90s and the early 2000s. Now almost all neurologists and all psychiatrists believe this, but at first they didn't. They fought it. Brains can grow new cells and make new connections throughout life. Brain and body experience alters the structure and connections in the brain, strengthening and growing and weakening them and changing structure based on your experience. One of the first evidences they had is cabbies in London. To just be a cabbie, you can just drive a cab, but to become a master cabbie, which you earn more money and you get more routes and you get better hours and everything. If you take this master cabbie exam, which means you have to memorize what they call the A through Z, the street names, and you have to be able to take a test and find any street in London, some of which are half a block long, and because London, is an old city and it grew over many, many centuries. And these master cabbies have an amazing visual memory. And what they found was that and they don't start studying the A through Z until they're adults. They found when some of these cabbies were able to have brain scans first and later donated their brains for study after they died, and they do autopsies on them. They found that the part that had to do with visual processing was way more complex and much more developed and much more massive than average everyday cabbies or everyday people. And so they knew that adult brains could change, and there's much more evidence as well. But that was one of the first ones they did that showed them that. I read this book that is like a novel by my friend Norman Doidge, a psychiatrist and neurologist, talking about this new point of view of brain plasticity. It's a terrific book. I recommend it to you. And it really shifted what I thought in terms of treating depression, because what we've discovered in this neurogenic and neuroatrophy hypothesis is that this isn't a set theory. Nobody knows what causes depression or what treats it the best. I'm giving you my ideas. But this hypothesis has a lot of evidence and more accumulating evidence, and more psychiatrists and neurologists are leaning in this direction now. So it's not a proven theory, as the broken brain theory isn't a proven theory, and the neurotransmitter theory is not a proven theory either, the one that medications are based on. So this is called the neurogenic and neuroatrophy hypothesis. And here's what it's about. Stress, which plays a key role in triggering depression, suppresses neurogenesis, which is the birth of new brain cells in the hippocampus, which is typically where they're born in the brain, in all the brains, but especially adult brains. That's what we're talking about here. And scientists have found evidence that the hippocampus shrinks in people who've had long-standing depression and long-standing stress. So what are the implications? Antidepressants encourage the growth of new brain cells. Now, so they may not be treating those neurotransmitters that they think they're treating. That may be bathing the brain in these neurotransmitters or these precursors to growing new brain cells. And that may be why treatment works, why these pharmacological treatments work, different from the way psychiatrists often think they work. And so there's a lot of evidence for this at this point. And again, some people are starting to do this. Here's the thing, in animals, because, again, not subject to the placebo effect typically, animals must take antidepressants 2 or 3 weeks before they bump up the birth rate of new brain cells, and the cells may take another 2 or 3 weeks to start functioning. And that's very consistent with the time lag that antidepressants show before they lift mood in people who are depressed. So here's the idea. If antidepressants are given during a period of chronic stress, which usually results in fewer brain cells being born, then it prevents that decline in what they call the neurogenesis, new brain cells being born. So people with head injuries in early adulthood experience higher rates of depression over their lifetimes. Now that may be because they have traumatic brain injury, or it may be that they've lost some of that functioning and some of the brain cells have died off, because that's really severe kind of brain damage typically. Exercise, which combats depression in people, also increases the rate of neurogenesis, or the birth of new brain cells in the hippocampus. So if we can get people moving, which is hard to do when people are depressed, and we're going to be talking about that, then we can make a difference. So does ECT, electroshock therapy, or electroconvulsive therapy. When people are really depressed, sometimes they have recommended shock treatment. And people are like, oh no, that's like out of the cuckoo's nest. No, that it actually can save their lives, because I started exercising as a result of learning this hypothesis, and I was kind of a couch potato before that. And one of the things I found is when you exercise and you're running, that's what I typically do, is run or walk. And when you're running, you're stressing the bones, and you're creating little microfractures in your bones. I didn't know this before I exercised, and I was reading a book about exercise, and then your bones grow back stronger. You create little microfractures, and your body says, hey, damage, let's send some repair stuff here, and your bones get stronger. Well, it's the same thing in the brain. When the brain gets stressed, the brain sends out a signal, create new brain cells, repair this. And it turns out that electroshock or electroconvulsive therapy, which is sometimes done with sort of insulin shock treatment, it shocks the brain, and it sends healing mechanisms there, or it puts into place these healing processes. So that may be why it works. They don't know why it works exactly. Again, this is part of the hypothesis. So here's some of the research stuff you can look at. But there's stuff in the brain that are hormones that encourage the growth of new brain cells. And typically these are there are four hormones that typically encourage the growth of new brain cells. And one is called BDNF, which some people have called the miracle grow of the brain. If you're not from the States, miracle grow is a thing that helps plants grow. It's a sort of a product in the United States that makes plants grow a lot. And so BDNF is brain-derived neurotropic factor, and that helps create new brain cells. So postmortem studies have shown that depressed people have decreased hippocampal and cortical BDNF levels, and when people take antidepressants, they have increased rates of BDNF. So it goes along with this hypothesis. And again, let's just skip this. Here's the typical things. You can have insulin-like growth factor, vascular endothelial growth factor, which helps more brain blood get into the brain, and then therefore it supports brain growth. And this BDNF, the brain-derived neurotropic factor. These are the things that if we can encourage them, either with medications, exercise, stimulation of the brain, learning a new language, anything that stimulates the brain can sometimes do this. Being in good health, eating healthy food, all this stuff can support brain growth, all right? So what affects brain growth? Learning new things to stretch your ability, not too much, and repeating these things through deliberate practice. So it might be physical things, or it might be cognitive things, like learning a new language. Music seems to be good for overall brain growth. And new physical abilities, juggling, typing, riding a bike, anything you learn that's new, and exercise. And exercise turns out to be one of the best things to grow new brain cells. And what do depressed people do? They move less and less as they get more and more depressed. So what we need to do is to help people start to exercise. So exercise helps blood vessel growth. You can increase the blood flow and the size of the blood vessels, and just like the heart. If the heart is functioning well, you have good heart health and good body health. Well, the same thing with the brain. If you get more blood in there, you're supporting brain growth. It helps you avoid cognitive decline with aging, but it also helps you avoid depression. So there's growing evidence that exercise works better than antidepressants, and it lasts longer. So let me give you this example. This was the best research that's been done so far, and it's called SMILE, the SMILE research project. It's done at Duke, Standard Medical Intervention in Long-Term Exercise. And they studied a lot of different conditions, but one of them is they had a bunch of people in this study, and 156 of the people in this study were diagnosed with major depression, MDD, major depressive disorder. And they were randomly assigned to 3 treatment groups. The first one was exercise treatment, and that involved brisk walking, jogging, or stationary bicycle riding 3 times a week with a 10-minute warm-up, 30-minute exercise, 5-minute cool down. Zoloft treatment, and again, if you're not from the States, Zoloft is an antidepressant medication. It's an SSRI. And so combined treatment, that is, they did exercise and the medication. Now, here's what blew my mind when I found the results of this. At the end of 4 months, medications and exercise helped everybody, or not everybody, but a lot of people. 60 to 70% of the people were vastly improved or symptom-free in all 3 of these experimental conditions. But here's what blew my mind. On 10-month follow-up, 38% of the medication subjects had had a recurrence of their depression. 31% of the combined condition had had a recurrence. That is, they exercised and took Zoloft, but only 8% of the people who were exercising had a recurrence. And people who continue to exercise were even less likely to have a recurrence of their depression. So here's what's amazing is that the amount of exercise made a difference. Every 50 minutes, 50 minutes of exercise per week correlated with a 50% drop in depression levels. So the more exercise you do up to a limit helps with people who are depressed. There's a whole bunch of research about this. This psychiatrist, when he found out about this research down in Texas, a guy named Trivedi, said, you know, I have some patients that are treatment resistant. No matter what medication I use, they don't seem to come out of their depression. I wonder if I try this exercise thing. So he got people who participated in moderately intense aerobics, such as exercising on a treadmill or stationary bicycle, 3 to 5 days a week, experienced a decline in their depressive symptoms by an average of 47% after 12 weeks. So essentially, 3 months. Those in low intensity groups, just were walking or moving a lot less or riding the bicycle at a very reduced level, had a 30% reduction in their depressive symptoms. And exercise helped these people who are called treatment resistant because they weren't responding to medication. So he's done a bunch. Trivedi is his name, and you can, again, the research is there. Middle-aged runners, this is a correlational study, who'd been running 3 to 5 times per week for 3 to 10 years were markedly less depressed than a matched comparison group. Now, correlation studies, maybe they were running more because they were less likely to be depressed, but there is some correlation there. They did some not exercise ones, but they gave people these cognitive brain training things that you see on TV, and there's some, on your computer or on your iPhone or your apps. When they got seniors to process things faster, which some of these brain training things do, they also decreased their likelihood of developing depression compared with a control group that weren't using these brain training apps by 38% a year out. So they were less likely to be depressed when they were exercising their brains with just cognitive exercise, not physical exercise. So obviously both. Seniors who'd never experienced exercise before experienced a mood-lifting effect, less depression and anxiety, and better reported quality of life from regular aerobic exercise 3 times a week on alternate days for 6 months. And again, there's study after study of this, and so when I started exercising, I actually didn't feel any mood-lifting effect, but I wasn't depressed. But it turns out that exercise has the most profound mood-lifting effect on people who are depressed. That is, they experience it, and the effect increased with the amount of exercise. They also found reductions in anger and anxiety through exercise. Now, this is aerobic exercise. Anaerobic, like lifting weights, there's mixed evidence. It can increase your anxiety but decrease your depression. So you have to be a little more careful with anaerobic, which is just muscle training, strength training. And the other thing is, you have to be aware of overtraining. Some people, you know, and people who do anorexia or people who are super compulsive and exercise all the time, they sometimes get more depressed. Famous example is a guy named Salazar, who was ran the New York City Marathon, won the New York City Marathon, and he got depressed the next year because he'd overtrained. And most of us don't have this problem, most of us undertrain. So the evidence shows that overexercising, which is exercising several times a day at training levels that are at or near your maximal training levels, is correlated with depressed moods. So don't overexercise, but up to a limit, most people will benefit, obviously physically, but they'll also do this. So how do you translate this into clinical work? If people are depressed, how do you get them to move? Because they're saying, I can't get out of bed. When they come, don't sit in your office, go walk around the block. If you're in a cold place, go walk around the mall and have your session walking around the mall. Anything you can do to get them moving. Get them to park a little farther away from your clinic. Get them to park, you know, if they go out shopping, a little farther away, and get a little more exercise. Get them to take the stairs instead of the elevator. Anything you can do. Encourage clients and patients to move as much as they're able. So, you know, walking sessions is one way. Baby steps, getting to do a little more exercise. The solutionary method, what helped them exercise before or do anything that was difficult, have them use that method. Get them to walk or move with a buddy. There's been studies saying if you commit to exercising with someone else, you're much more likely to exercise and stick with that exercise program than when you do it alone. Now, some people are self-motivating and they can do it, but again, depression is in part a problem of motivation because the parts of the brain that have to do with motivation and dopamine production, you know, that get you excited and feel rewards about things are under-functioning typically in people who are depressed. So that buddy system is a connection ability. We talked about connection being important, as well as kind of a guilt-inducing way. If you don't want to go out one day, but your friend wants to go out, they tend to pull you out. If they don't want to go out, you tend to pull them out. So link it to motivation. When I started exercise, I found out about the brain stuff. I loved having my brain, I love learning. So for me, even though I was a couch potato, I got motivated because I wanted my brain to function better as I aged. And then I had a little midlife stomach, so I had an away from motivation. I want to get rid of my midlife tummy by exercising more, and I wanted to have better brain functioning, and I don't suffer from depression anymore, but I wanted to have a better brain that could learn and take things in as I aged. And so I had motivation. So figure out what that person's motivation is and link it to that motivation. So we've covered a lot of material. There may be some questions. There may not be. We'll find out in a couple of minutes. But remember, you can get a copy of these slides because I went over some of them really quickly because, again, this is a presentation I sometimes do over the course of 2 days. And I've just tried to get all these 6 methods to you as quickly as possible. And these are so exciting to me. And you can use these, again, as supplements to what you do or as treatments in their own right.
Great. Bill, thank you so much. That was just fantastic. We do have a number of questions here, and I'll coordinate the Q&A for you. We'll start with this one. When working with a depressed client, how do you ascertain which approach or combination of approaches a particular client might best respond to?
I'm sorry, I'm going to have a terrible answer to that, which is intuition. That is, I know all these. But, you know, the thing for me is having all these in your repertoire gives you so many openings and so many places. You know, if I try inviting them to the future and they go, oh, no, there's no future for me, then that's not the one. You know, it's a bit of back and forth. How do they respond? If they say, whoa, you know, that's pretty interesting. Yeah, I could do that. Then that's the one I'm going to go with. And I usually, it's like a smorgasbord. You lay out this smorgasbord and you see what people are going up and taking from the smorgasbord. And having these 6, in addition to whatever ones you already have, I assume you have some yourself, the medication ones or cognitive ones or whatever other methods you have, just having 6 more in your repertoire, I think, is nice. It's so you can intuitively follow where you think, I think this person, sometimes they say something that tells me that they, like, here's an example. I had a person come in one time and say to me, shows up in my office and she says, I have to kill myself. And in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, wait a minute, you know, I'm not going to challenge her like this, but I'm thinking, she has to kill herself, but she rolled out of bed, did her makeup, fixed her hair, got dressed, got to my office to come and tell me she's going to kill herself. And I'm thinking probably 99% of her wants to die, and 1% of her is hoping I'll talk her out of it. That's why she showed up in my office. So for me, that's an indicator that she needs the intervention of hope for the future. So I'll probably start there, and I'll work backwards. And if that doesn't work, then I try one of the other ones. So that's the best answer I have. Mostly I just use intuition, but sometimes they give me an indication of which one seems to be appealing to them.
The question I had, you were speaking of Martin Seligman's work earlier. You know, he wrote a lot about learned helplessness, and how that can lead to depression, and essentially when clients are trying all different types of methods to get through the depression, and nothing seems to be working, and it, that learned helplessness starts to set in. They're sitting there maybe in that dark room like you were talking about, laying in bed watching that commercial telling them about this wonder drug, and the next thing you know, they're scheduling an appointment with a psychiatrist, and they're getting prescribed this wonder drug, and they're taking it and thinking, well, that's it, that's all I have to do. I really loved all your theories. How do we convince the clients? How do we convince society at large that there's more work to be done? That therapy, in addition to pharmacological approaches, are so necessary for long term.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that Seligman work on learned helplessness, which he did with dogs, very interesting stuff, and maybe I'll tell you something about that. But let me just answer the question a little more directly first, and that is, what I'd say to people, I came across this quotation a while ago. It's from a French guy, Émile Chartier. He said, "There's nothing as dangerous as an idea when it's the only one you have." And I like that saying, because what I would say to people is, yeah, maybe the medications will work and they'll be all you need, but I always like to have a little insurance. I always like to have 2 or 3 things in case the one doesn't totally work out, or in case it doesn't, you don't respond to those medications as well as you hoped. And so that'd be great if the medications work. And I want to help you have at least one more method that's under your control, that's not the medications, that's under your control, that I think might be really helpful for you. Sorry, I'm going to do this thing here. And so that's the first thing. Second thing is that Martin Seligman thing is very interesting. I don't know if you've ever heard him talk about how he came up with this, but he was in the 60s working with dogs. He was an experimental psychologist, and he didn't like rats. He found them creepy, and he'd always loved dogs when he was a kid. So he thought, I'm going to work with dogs in my lab. And what he did was built these cages where the dogs, it was sort of a wire mesh bottom to the cage, and there were two parts to the cage, and there was a hole in the middle, and the dog could go from one side of the cage to another. And what the terrible experimenters did is they put on a small shock on one side of the cage, and of course the dog would go to the other side of the cage. And then they put on the shock on both sides of the cage, and there was no escape from the shock. And the dogs go back and forth for a while, but after a while they would get depressed. That is, they developed that learned helplessness. No matter what they did, they couldn't get away from the shock, and the dogs would sleep most of the day, and they looked like human beings who were depressed. So Seligman had determined that. And then years later, when he came up with positive psychology, he was thinking back to those experiments, and he thought, well, always with an experiment is statistics. If you have 100 dogs and 96 of them get depressed or look depressed when they go through the experiment, then you've shown the effect with a pretty good probability that it's reliable. But he started to think back on the 4 dogs that never got depressed out of those 100. He thought, those are the dogs we should have studied. And what did those dogs do differently? After a couple of days, the experimenters turned off the shock on the other side of the cage from the one the dog was laying in. And those psychotically optimistic dogs were getting up every couple of hours and moving to the other side of the cage to see if the shock was off. The other ones just assumed it was always going to be there forever. And so I think studying those psychotically optimistic dogs, that is the ones who keep going for trying to change things. So I would tell that story to my clients in my clinic and say, yeah, medications may work, but let me tell you the story about these dogs. And there were some dogs that did get out of the shock and that were able to get out by their own efforts because they kept trying something new rather than accepting that this is the situation, I can't do anything about it.
Okay, great. One final question. Knowing how deep-seated and powerful the patterns of depression are, do you have any tools for clients, new clients especially, to keep them on track and keep them from sinking back to these depressive patterns in between sessions? For example, do you ever enlist spouses or family members to help keep them on track?
Absolutely. And the other thing is that I use an analogy. Sometimes I'll say, you know, look at what we're doing in here is like me being the coach by the side, or the you know, you're running a race and I'm by the side of the road and I'm firing the starting pistol. And if I fire the starting pistol and you just look at me and say, how come I'm not feeling better? Once I fire the starting pistol, I say, because you have to go, you have to move, you have to do something. And so I'll tell them analogies like that and say, I know it's really hard. And this, you're not going to be running a race. You're going to be crawling a race at first. Then you're going to be walking the race. And then you may get up to a jog eventually. But I'm going to need you to make an effort. And yeah, I enlist people around them, their best friends, their family members, and see if they can help support them. But you know, that can backfire because if they're saying, hey, you know, the therapist said you have to get up and walk the steps, they go, oh, just get off my back. It can backfire. So you have to be very, very careful about that. But again, I'm searching for the patterns that don't work and the patterns that do work in their family members or their friends or their environment. So if I say, so have you been encouraging him to go out and walk all the time? They say, yeah, I tell them they have to get out of bed. I say, then stop doing that because it's not working. Let's just stop that pattern. Let's find another one. You know, you might just tell them, I'm really sorry you're feeling this bad, and see what that does. And we do a bunch of experiments, and that's the second frame that I use for it is, we're not telling you this is what you have to do. We're going to do a bunch of experiments and find out what works for you because everybody is different. And that goes back to the first question is, how do you decide these things? You only decide by experiments. And this is the wonder of human beings. Human beings are natural experimenters. Almost all other animals are so much more programmed and fixed in their behavior patterns. And human beings, they're about as adaptable on the planet as cockroaches. They live in the Arctic and they live in the Sahara and you know, they live in houses and they live in tents and they can survive really amazing conditions because human beings are constant human experimenters and they're just trying to find what works. Human beings have gone to the moon. Human beings have invented fax machines and, you know, video conferencing. It's incredible because we keep experimenting and what doesn't work we discard and what does work we do more of that. So I'm going to ask you to be a scientist with your depression and I'm going to ask your family members to be a scientist with your depression because some things are going to help and some things are going to hurt and some things are not going to make any difference one way or the other.
Bill, on behalf of the entire university, I'd like to thank you for such an engaging and informative lecture. We're so happy you're able to join us today.
Oh, well, thank you so much for inviting me and thank you for being here. And thank you to all the people that are watching, streaming online in a time-shifted way. I so appreciate everyone who participated and everyone who's watching. Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the School of Behavioral Sciences at California Southern University.